In the world of music, there are certain figures who transcend their instruments. On the violin, there was Jascha Heifetz, who, like Paganini, demonstrated technical mastery so complete that audience questioned whether he was even human or if he had made a pact with the devil. On the guitar, there was Jimi Hendrix, who bent sound itself into shapes no one had imagined possible. In opera, there was Luisa Tetrazzini, whose voice possessed a range, agility, and palette of colors that left listeners speechless. And in the world of bamboo, there was Watazumi Doso Roshi, a man so much larger than life that separating fact from legend has become almost impossible. Researching Watazumi is unlike researching almost any other musician. The deeper you dig, the stranger the story becomes. He appears in photographs like some wandering mountain sage. Stories surround him like mist. Accounts contradict one another. Details disappear. Myths emerge. At times, he almost seems less like a historical figure and more like a character from folklore. A man who seemingly emerged from nowhere. A man who claimed the mountains as his teacher. A man who transformed a simple piece of bamboo into a vehicle for spiritual awakening. His eccentricity could make even the wildest artist seem ordinary. He trained with brutal physical discipline. He carried massive root-end bamboo flutes that few could even produce a sound from. He challenged conventions, ignored institutions, and built an entire philosophy around breath, nature, and raw human vitality. To some, he was a genius. To others, a madman. Perhaps in truth, he was both. But before the stories, beyond the myths, beyond the larger-than-life personality, lies an undeniable truth. Quote, "Music must reflect the natural world. When you do that, it allows for a natural resonance in the mind of the listener." Watazumi Doso Roshi changed the course of modern Shakuhachi history. His influence can still be heard today in the concert halls, meditation halls, mountain retreats, and bamboo workshops around the world. So who was this mysterious man? Where did he come from? What did he actually teach? And why more than 30 years later after his death does his name still inspire awe, controversy, and fascination among shakuhachi players everywhere? Today we remove the mask and uncover the extraordinary life of one of the most influential and perhaps most misunderstood figures in the shakuhachi history. This is Watazumi Doso Roshi, Unmasked. Part 1. Forged by Kyushu, War, and Post-War Japan. Any attempt to understand Watazumi-do Doso must begin with a simple observation. He was not a product of modern Japan. He was born in November 1911, only 43 years after the Meiji Restoration and during a period when Japan was still rapidly transforming from a feudal society into an industrial and military power. By the time he died in 1992, Japan had become one of the wealthiest nations in the world. Few Japanese experienced such dramatic social change across a single lifetime. The gap between the Japan of Watazumi's youth and the Japan most people know today is enormous. His unusual personality, uncompromising discipline, obsession with breath, and physical conditioning distrust of institution, and emphasis on direct experience over doctrine make far more sense when viewed against the world in which he was raised. Growing up in Kyushu. Watazumi was born in Fukuoka Prefecture, on the island of Kyushu. Most sources identify his birth name as Tanaka Masaru. However, according to researcher Kunimi Masafumi, he writes, quote, Watazumi Doso's real name was Tanaka Hisao. He changed his name multiple times. Tanaka Kendo, Tanaka Yuhi, Ichijo Fumon, Watazumi Fumon, and eventually even changed his registered family name to Watazumi Doso. Later, he updated this note, saying that according to the family registry, it was Watazumi Kendo. His early childhood remains largely undocumented, a circumstance that is entirely fitting for a man who later cultivated mystery around his personal history. Even when you dig deeply, it seems impossible to find any information on his family or any lineage information. What is certain is that he grew up in the northern part of Kyushu, a region unlike Tokyo or Kyoto. It was a place of farmers, fishermen, miners, laborers, and strong regional traditions. During Watazumi's childhood, northern Kyushu was one of the industrial engines of Japan. The Chikuho coalfields of Fukuoka were among the most important coal-producing regions in the nation and helped fuel Japan's modernization and military expansion. Coal mines, steel mills, railroads, and heavy industry transformed the region during the late Meiji and early Showa periods. At the same time, rural life remained harsh. Many families still lived close to subsistent levels. Physical labor was a daily necessity rather than a recreational choice. A young man growing up in Kyushu would have been surrounded by a culture that valued endurance, perseverance, obedience, and toughness. These values later became central to Watazumi's teaching. His later insistence that true development comes through physical training, difficult breathing exercises, and daily discipline reflects attitudes that would have been familiar to many people raised in rural Japan before World War II. The Japan of his youth. When Watazumi was born, Japan was entering the Taisho era. Although historians often remember the Taisho period as relatively liberal, most ordinary Japanese still lived lives shaped by hierarchy and duty. Children were taught loyalty to family, community, and the emperor. Education stressed moral training as much as academic achievement. The idea that the individual should subordinate personal desires to a large collective purpose was deeply ingrained. By the time Watazumi reached adulthood in the 1930s, Japan was becoming increasingly militarized. Nationalist sentiment intensified following economic hardship, political instability, and military successes abroad. Young men were expected to contribute to the nation, and military service was regarded as both a duty and a rite of passage. This was the world that formed Watazumi's generation. Service during wartime. Watazumi himself stated that he served as a physical fitness or martial arts instructor in the Imperial Japanese Army during the war years. If this account is correct, he would have been in his 30s during the height of Japan's wartime mobilization. This detail is significant. The Imperial Japanese military placed enormous emphasis on physical conditioning, endurance, discipline, and what was often called spiritual strength. Military training sought to cultivate obedience, perseverance, self-sacrifice, and the ability to endure hardship. Physical training was viewed not just as exercise but as moral development. Military and educational systems increasingly emphasized physical conditioning as a part of national mobilization efforts. Army training also relied heavily upon existing Japanese social values. Recruits were taught that personal hardship should be accepted without complaint, and training often focused as much on mental resilience as on technical skill. The Imperial Japanese Army did not view military training as preparation for combat alone. Its purpose was to transform ordinary civilians into men who embodied discipline, endurance, obedience, and unwavering commitment to duty. Physical conditioning moral instruction, and spiritual development were considered inseparable. Military leaders believed that the superior spirit could compensate for material deficiencies, and throughout a soldier's career, enormous emphasis was placed on cultivating what was known as Yamato Damashi, or the Japanese spirit. By the time most young men entered the army, military values had already been introduced through the educational system. Boys participated in physical drills, martial arts, group exercises, and patriotic ceremonies throughout their school years. Upon conscription, however, military life became far more rigorous. Daily life for an enlisted soldier was highly structured. Reveille, or the morning call, typically occurred before sunrise. The day began with barracks inspections, cleaning duties, and physical exercise. Morning hours were often devoted to drill, weapons training, and tactical instruction. Afternoons included field exercises, route marches, bayonet practice, fortification work, or marksmanship. Equipment maintenance occupied significant amounts of time. Soldiers cleaned rifles, repaired gear, and maintained uniforms to strict standards. Evening hours frequently included lectures on military ethics, study of regulations, and spiritual education before lights out. The physical standards were demanding, but not focused on athletic achievement in the modern sense. The goal was durability rather than fitness. Soldiers ran, and they ran, marched, and they marched, climbed, wrestled, swam, and carried heavy loads. They were expected to function effectively, despite exhaustion, hunger, poor weather, and sleep deprivation. Officers often viewed comfort as detrimental to character development. Relationships between senior and junior personnel were often harsh. Corporal punishment, slapping, punching, and other forms of physical discipline were widespread throughout the army. This was regarded as a means of toughening men psychologically, though it often produced a culture of fear and intimidation. Bayonet training occupied a particularly important place within the curriculum. Japanese military doctrine emphasized aggressive close combat, and considerable time was devoted to thrusting drills, parrying techniques, charges, and mock duels. Many officers believed that determination and offensive spirit could overcome an opponent's technological superiority. Consequently, bayonet training was regarded not only as combat preparation, but also as a method of cultivating courage and fighting spirit. Senior soldiers who had endured abuse during their own training frequently imposed similar treatment upon new recruits. Alongside physical training existed an equally intensive program of ideological education. Soldiers regularly studied the official code of ethics for Japanese military personnel, known as the Imperial Rescript to soldiers and sailors, as well as selected writings influenced by samurai traditions. Particular attention was paid to concepts of loyalty, sacrifice, obedience, and selflessness. The famous samurai text was Hagakure, and it exerted considerable influence on military thinking, especially its emphasis upon duty and willingness to die in service of one's own obligation. Officer training followed a different path. Future officers generally attended the Imperial Japanese Army Academy. The first portion of training combined academics, horsemanship, martial arts, and military studies. Later stages emphasized practical military leadership. Cadets spent extended periods attached to active army units where they observed operations and learned to manage soldiers. Upon graduation, newly commissioned officers initially served as senior non-commissioned officers before advancing to lieutenant rank. Promotion to a higher command required attendance to the Army War College, where officers studied military theory, doctrine, planning, logistics, and staff procedures. Considerable attention was given to German military thought, which heavily influenced Japanese doctrine during this period. Staff officers were expected to formulate plans, while junior officers were expected to execute them faithfully. Initiative was generally less emphasized than obedience and determination. During wartime, training schedules were compressed dramatically. The demand of combat required replacement to be prepared quickly, and programs that once took years were condensed into a matter of months. Recruits received intensive instruction in weapons, fieldcraft, and combat skills before deployment. They were also trained to operate captured enemy equipment because Japanese forces frequently relied upon battlefield improvisation and locally acquired resources. What is striking when examining this system is how closely it mirrors many of the themes that later appeared in Watazumi's own philosophy. The emphasis on physical conditioning, rigorous daily practice, breath control, endurance, discipline, mental toughness, and the cultivation of inner strength were all deeply embedded within the military culture of his generation. Although Watazumi ultimately rejected military institutions and developed a highly individual spiritual path, many of the methods he later employed, daily training before dawn, physical hardship, breath cultivation, and the belief that the personal transformation arises through disciplined practice would have been immediately recognizable to anyone who had experienced the world of the Imperial Japanese Army. If you are interested in this topic and want to learn more, I suggest reading the War Department Technical Manual, TME 30-480, Handbook on Japanese Military Forces, though some of the information there is U.S. propaganda. The next resource I recommend is Soldier of the Sun, The Rise and Fall of the Imperial Japanese Army. After the war. This does not mean that Watazumi simply adopted military ideas. In fact, his later philosophy can be viewed as a transformation of those ideas into something deeply personal and spiritual, yet the roots are difficult to ignore. Witnessing the collapse of a world. The most formative event of Watazumi's life may not have been the war itself, but Japan's defeat in 1945. For his generation, the collapse was profound. The emperor renounced his divine status. The military was dissolved. The ideology that had dominated public life suddenly disappeared. Cities lay in ruins. Millions returned from military service to find the country transformed. For many Japanese, long-held assumptions about authority, society, and identity were shattered. Watazumi reportedly left military life after the war and entered a Rinzai Zen monastery. This move makes historical sense. Many Japanese sought new meaning after the devastation of the war. Religious practice offered a path toward understanding a world that no longer resembled the one they had known. Yet Watazumi's relationship with the organized Zen appears to have been complicated. According to his own accounts, he eventually became dissatisfied with institutionalized Zen. He felt that the Zen practice lacked sufficient attention to the body, breathing, and physical vitality. He ultimately abandoned formal religious structures and created his own approach, which became known as Watazumi-do. This rejection of established institutions may itself reflect the experience of someone who had lived through the collapse of both military and religious authority. Japanese Rinzai Zen. In the film Sukiyaki and Chips, The Japanese Sound of Music, Watazumi mentions that, quote, he had joined the Rinzai monastery, close quote, but had to leave because their breathing was too strict. However, it is unlikely that he reached the Rinzai title of Roshi during his time at the monastery. His Roshi title may be something that he gave himself. I reached out to Brian Victoria, a senior research fellow at the Oxford Center for Buddhist Studies, for more information, and he had this to say, quote, as for being a Roshi, this is, of course, an honorary title of respect, not an attained or conferred rank. That said, in the Rinzai sect, it is traditionally reserved for those priests who have received Inka Shome, a seal of enlightenment, from their master, signifying that they have successfully completed or solved all of the koan assigned to them by their master. Traditionally, this is very difficult to accomplish in a 4-year period, though, at least in theory, it's not impossible. Given that it appears Watazumi chose to leave the Rinzai sect soon after his training, I seriously doubt whether he received Inka Shome from his master. That said, if you know the name of his master, you may be able to find out whether he is considered to have received Dharma transmission, Shihol, from his master. From Brian Victoria, personal email June of 2026. Since we do not know which monastery or who his master was, there is no way to confirm any of this information. Why breath became central. One of the most remarkable features of Watazumi's teaching is his obsession with breath. To modern students, this can appear unusual, but viewed historically, it becomes understandable. Throughout his life, Watazumi experienced environments in which breathing carried special significance. 1. The traditional Japanese martial arts. 2. Military physical training. 3. Zen meditation. 4. Shakuhachi suijo practice. All of these disciplines place extraordinary importance on respiration. Watazumi himself states, quote, now looking at breathing, I see 4 different kinds of breathing. Number 1 is rough breathing, and then strong breathing, soft breathing, and weak breathing. The kinds of breathing that we use in playing these jogu flutes are these four. These four kinds of breathing are not just breathing used in normal daily life. What is used in normal daily life is the unconscious breathing. Unconscious breathing is simply the movement of the lungs. But just using unconscious breathing, the simple movement of the lungs does not bring a person into strength or health. You are sure to become sick or even die, and so you have to move away from unconscious breathing and come into conscious or mindful breathing." Close quote. What made Watazumi unique was the degree to which he elevated breathing above everything else. He frequently taught that the purpose of playing shakuhachi was not the music but the cultivation of life force through conscious breathing. He called the instrument a tool rather than a musical instrument, and often described music as secondary to personal transformation. This emphasis likely emerged from the convergence of his experience, one in physical training learned before and during the war, 2 Zen training after the war, 3 the traditional shakuhachi repertoire that he was learning, and 4 his own highly individual conclusions. The result was a philosophy unlike any conventional school of shakuhachi. A product of Kyushu. There is also something distinctly Kyushu-like about Watazumi. Kyushu has long produced religious reformers, martial artists, and unconventional spiritual figures. Compared with cultural centers of Kyoto and Tokyo, Kyushu has often fostered independent traditions and strong regional identities. Watazumi embodied this spirit. He rejected standardization of shakuhachi aesthetics. He rejected institutional Zen. He rejected conventional musical values. He even rejected the idea that shakuhachi should be regarded primarily as an instrument. Instead, he advocated for direct experience, personal cultivation, and practical training. This independence may have been strengthened by growing up far from the cultural establishment of central Japan. From a video of his 1989 performance lecture series, he states, quote, "I run naked every day. Once while running I fell and hurt my leg badly. Once I fell and completely messed up my jaw. Once I was running naked and I was inspired to run from Sakurajo to Mitaka, which is very far. And the weather was so extreme that I had to hold onto walls in order to finally make it home. Once home, I took a bath, and only after I got out, I realized that the whole run took me 9 hours." Part 2. Watazumi's Philosophy. Philosophy of Watazumi-do Doso. At the center of Watazumi Doso's outlook was a radical refusal to treat music as music, in the conventional sense. He did not see the shakuhachi as an instrument for art, entertainment, or aesthetic refinement, but as a vehicle for suijo, concentrated breathing, a form of ascetic discipline in which sound becomes a byproduct of direct experience in existence rather than artistic intention. He even called his instruments dogu, meaning tool. In this framework, there is no separation between practice and life, no distinction between performer and performance, and no meaningful division between sound and silence. The flute is not expressing something, it is simply being used as means of confronting being itself. This position placed him in deliberate tension with both modern concert culture and traditional temple lineage. Where classical shakuhachi schools often emphasize repertoire, transmission, and stylistic refinement, Watazumi stripped practice away back towards what he considered a more primordial state: breath, body, and bamboo. Technique was not a path towards beauty, but a method of exhausting ego. Even improvement was suspect if it reinforces self-conscious artistry. In this sense, his playing often feels less like interpretation and more like living in the mountains far away from society. Quote, "Next we have tsukami, which means to grasp, and that refers to the movement of the fingers and the feet, the ability of your fingers to move freely in any direction. A person who cannot move their fingers freely is indicating already that his blood vessels are stopped up and underdeveloped. And so I meet a musician and look at the movement of his fingers. I don't even need to hear his playing or his instrument to know what kind of musician he is. So everybody, the movement of the fingers is extremely important. However, just the simple movement of the fingers is not the only thing. You also have to look at the movement of the legs and toes. You all wear around shoes and heavy boots that cramp your feet and cramp the movement of your toes. So at least when you have your shoes off and you are taking a bath, you should make extra effort to move your toes around so that they can move in any direction freely. And so to repeat again, if your fingers cannot move freely in any direction with complete alacrity, then there is no way your playing of the instrument can be any good. The next is called nobasu, which means to lengthen. If you ask what to lengthen, it is your entire body. To move the thick muscles of the body is extremely important, and moving the largest muscle section in your body will also bring into play all of the smaller muscles, and so that when you are playing an instrument, it's not simply the movement of your fingers, or this or that, it's the movement and the action of the entire body." Close quote. Philosophically, Watazumi's worldviews draws loosely on strands of Zen thought associated with figures as Ikkyu Soljun, especially the anti-institutional, iconoclastic tendency to break with formal religious respectability in pursuit of direct realization. Like Ikkyu, Watazumi embraced contradiction and disruption as tools rather than problems to be solved. He also resonates with the modern interpretations of Zen popularized by D.T. Suzuki, particularly that the idea that Zen is not a belief system but an experiential awakening beyond conceptual thought. Though Watazumi pushed this even further into embodied sonic practice rather than philosophical exposition. Quote, "When I train students in the way of Watazumi, the first thing that I train them in is the rough breathing. What I'm going to do now I don't call performing or playing for people. Instead, I call it the concentrated breathing, suizhou. To blow is just simply a technique. My kind of blowing is not just simply blowing, it's the movement of the entire personality. Just to repeat again, what I was saying, the movement of the life force, the movement that comes out of the instrument, is just simply your own pulse. The way of Watazumi, then, is to express the sound of your own life force." Close quote. In the post-war Japanese avant-garde context, his stance also intersected, sometimes productively and sometimes contentiously, with Western experimental thought. The influence of John Cage is often invoked in relation to Watazumi, particularly around silence, indeterminacy, and the collapse of intention. However, whereas Cage tended to frame non-intentionality through chance operations and conceptual structures, Watazumi grounded it in physical discipline, breath training, endurance, and a harsh stripping away of aesthetic framing. Sound was not allowed to happen. It was forced into being through confrontation with the body. Watazumi exclaimed that all the academics and famous musicians, which included John Cage, couldn't understand the one sound, so he clapped his hands. And they still didn't get it, so rather than explaining it, he simply picked up his bamboo and began to play. Quote, "When you hear some music or hear some sound, if for some reason you like it very well, the reason is that sound is in balance or in harmony with your pulse. And so making a sound, you try to make various different sounds that imitate various different sounds of the universe. But what you are finally making is your own sound, the sound of yourself." Close quote. Similarly, parallels are sometimes drawn with Toru Takemitsu, especially in the shared sensitivity to breath, space, and timbral presence. Yet, Takemitsu's approach remained rooted in composition and orchestration, while Watazumi rejected composition as a governing principle altogether. For him, written music, in the strict Western sense, risked becoming an abstraction that removed the player from direct encounter with reality. Quote, "So in that sound, you have to put in your balls, your strength, and your own specialness. And what you are putting in there is your own life and your own life force." Close quote. Watazumi Doso's philosophy can be understood as an uncompromising form of practice-based metaphysics. Reality is not just interpreted through music, but revealed through the removal of music as a category. Suizhou is not a method of performance, it is a discipline of undoing. The shakuhachi becomes not an expressive voice, but a blunt instrument for dissolving the boundary between breath and world. Quote, "It is fine that you are all deep into music, but there's something deeper, and if you would go deeper, if you go to the source of where the music is being made, you'll find something even more interesting. At the source, everyone's individual music is made. If you ask what the deep place is, it's your own life, and it's knowing your own life, that own way that you live." Close quote. The Hochiku. Another critical point to understand about Watazumi is that he did not refer to his instruments as shakuhachi. He called them hochiku, literally dharma bamboo, or bamboo of the dharma. For Watazumi, these were not musical instruments in the conventional sense. They were not designed primarily to produce beautiful sounds. play in tune or to satisfy the expectations of modern musical performance. Instead, they were tools for training, self-cultivation, and direct engagement with nature. Watazumi consistently emphasized the use of raw, natural bamboo instruments, often retaining much of their original shape and character, compared to the carefully crafted and acoustically refined shakuhachi favored by most players. Many of Watazumi's hochiku appear rough, primitive, and even crude. Several accounts from those connected to Watazumi further illustrate his unconventional attitude towards these instruments. Although some are difficult to verify with certainty, one story claims that when traveling he refused to use protective cases for his flutes. Instead, he would gather them together in a simple piece of string and send them through baggage handling with little concern of their safety. Whether entirely accurate or not, the story reflects the broader image many students and observers had of him, a man who viewed hochiku not as precious possessions but as natural objects and training implements. Another account suggests that many of Watazumi instruments were made by the renowned hochiku maker Okubo Kodo. According to some reports, Okubo produced hundreds of flutes for Watazumi over the years, many of which were never actually played by him. At the same time, it is entirely possible that Watazumi also played instruments of his own making. Like many practitioners working closely with natural bamboo, he possessed the knowledge and expertise necessary to shape and prepare instruments himself. Some hochiku associated with Watazumi bear a yaki-in, or burned stamp, used as a mark of identification. These stamps can occasionally be found in instruments attributed to him, although their presence alone does not necessarily establish provenance. As with many aspects of Watazumi's life, separating documented fact from oral tradition can be challenging. Stories, memories, and legends often surround influential figures, and Watazumi is no exception. Yet, regardless of the precise details, the surviving instruments and accounts consistently point to a man who regarded the hochiku not as a musical instrument to be perfected, but as a vehicle for spiritual training and direct expression of his philosophy. That being said, he did request that this term hochiku be abandoned because it caused misunderstandings among learners. Note: the background to the change from hochiku to dogu is described in the educational lecture number 6, The World of Watazumi-do, Kaihatsu Seinen, issue 75, October of 1974. It explains, quote, "The tools used in suijo were originally called hochiku. However, when people hear the word hochiku, they tend to fixate on the term itself and forget that it is simply a tool of Watazumi-do. Therefore, we changed the name to dogu, tool. This change came after a lecture at a religious university in the United States in 1972, where professors and students from various backgrounds said, 'Watazumi-do is a new philosophy and we wish to study it further, but calling it hochiku makes it sound like a form of performance art. Please stop using that term and instead clearly present it as a way. We will also make efforts to correct misunderstandings and spread proper understandings.' Hearing this, I felt though I were being taught by my own students, and I immediately changed the terminology I had used for many years from hochiku to dogu. In Watazumi-do, Fragments of Thought, under the section, quote, awareness, it also states, quote, errors should be corrected immediately. Yet, this obvious principle is rarely followed. Most people either cover up mistakes or justify them, ultimately causing harm to others. This reflects a lack of awareness. It is shameful for a human being not to correct oneself when realizing an error." Close quote. His repertoire. The common assumption of Watazumi is that he is a fuke player. However, he states the following on the back of his CD, Hochiku. Quote, "Watazumi-do originated from the Zen fuke sect, but the reason he left the fuke sect and opened his own path was because he was not satisfied with fuke playing. This was because it was thought that among those who regarded themselves as Zen practitioners, many merely pursued outward forms, and as a result, few sought to approach the truth through their own direct experience. The new state attained through practice may be said to be neither nothingness nor being, nor attached to either, yet encompassing both, transcending them. The state is divided into two aspects, body and function, called natural law, tai, and way law, yo. First is natural law. Through regulating breath and breathing and bodily movement, one seeks to embody the most natural state possible. This is considered the foundation of all human activity, and the cultivation of body and mind is said to begin here. Next, the expression of this natural law is called way law. This is carried out through blowing a single piece of bamboo known as hochiku. Thus, The characteristic feature of Watazumi-do is that it takes jo, meditation, concentration, or settled mind power as its essential principle, and from that state practices sui-jo, blowing in meditative concentration. When one speaks about blowing a bamboo tube with finger holes, people immediately think of the shakuhachi. However, although the shakuhachi is fundamentally a musical instrument, the hochiku is not considered a musical instrument. A musical instrument aims at beautiful and brilliant tones, and therefore technique inevitably becomes necessary. As a result, one may drift away from nature and become centered solely on human concerns. In contrast, the hochiku seeks to preserve the natural qualities inherent in the bamboo itself and eliminate the distinction between the bamboo and the person blowing it. The goal is to reach the sound of naturalness, that is neither bamboo nor person, but arises of itself. This is why it is said not to be playing the instrument, but rather blowing in concentration. Therefore, its construction already differs that of the shakuhachi. The shakuhachi is designed so that sound can be produced easily. The hochiku, however, differs in that sound. It must be brought forth through the attitude and state of the persons practicing sui-jo. No modifications are made to the bamboo in order to make sound produce easier through various techniques. The hochiku is not used like the shakuhachi, where many different pieces are performed on a single instrument. Rather, a particular bamboo is used to express both stillness and movement." Close quote. Now, in regards to the repertoire, the original notation of Watazumi was written in the Fuhou system. In my personal collection, I only have 2 of the many Watazumi scores. It is very difficult to discern where he learned each and every piece, but what we do have is a short list of teachers that Watazumi studied under. One thing that is revealing, however, is one of his chosen names, Humon, which puts him directly in the lineage of the Ichoken tradition. This covers a large body of the pieces he played and taught Yokoyama Katsuya. As for some of the other works, he most likely learned them from Nakamura Kikufu, Onishi Baisen, Tsunoda Rogetsu I, and Uramoto Setcho, whom he met after entering Takahashi Kuzan's studio, albeit for a short time. I wouldn't be surprised personally if Watazumi learned tamuke from Takahashi Kuzan due to a localized fingering system that was used mainly on shading the second hole for Rei Meri. Kunimi sensei notes this: "It is recorded in a letter from Takahashi Kuzan to Tsukamoto Kido, dated June 26, 1958, that Ichijo Fumon, later known as Watazumi, briefly entered Kuzan's studio, but soon left after being introduced to Uramoto Setcho. The 2 men were fundamentally incompatible, and it is likely that very little instruction actually took place. According to Kanda Kainyu sensei, it is more plausible that the transmission of tamuke from Watazumi Doso to Nakamura came through Meikudo, a Kyoto practitioner shared between Kuzan and Watazumi. There is no other convincing explanation. These localized fingerings may have also come through that route." Here is a picture of that original letter from Takahashi Kuzan, and this is what it says. "Replying to your letter, thank you very much for promptly sending me Myowan, Light and Darkness, and also for your kind message. I am deeply grateful. Fumon-sama, Watazumi, once became my pupil, but because he has a romantic temperament, I thought that he would be better suited elsewhere and sent him over to Uramoto Setcho's studio. He seems to sympathize greatly with their tendencies and is presently absorbed in them. By nature, he has always been prolific and somewhat flamboyant. He is a shallow-hearted and rather simple fellow. But when such shallowness goes too far, it tends to become regrettable. Therefore, I fear that the person you inquired about and introduced may end up disappointed. I imagine this has caused you various inconveniences and burdens. Nevertheless, that you continue to show great compassion and understanding is something truly rare and admirable in this world." Part 3. Early Articles in Sankyoku Magazine. Matt Gillian writes in Sankyoku Magazine and the Invention of the Shakuhachi as a religious instrument in the early 20th century about how Japan's rapid change not only affected the political understandings of Japan, but the music and religion of the nation. He went to this collection and read many of the articles from the early 20th century, which ultimately was the cause for many of the pseudo-historical beliefs about the shakuhachi. Inside those articles are a collection by Watazumi Humon. I requested the documents and received the collection in pre-war Japanese. It was a fascinating read, and I want to share here a little bit about the 7-part article collection titled Komuso Licensing, Then and Now. Now we know from my previous video on Kinko Kurosawa, the Komuso licensing was quite an issue. There is no need to repeat that information here, so let's start to look at some of his views. Throughout his 7-part article on the Komuso licensing, many of the points he brings up are quite interesting. However, none of these points are ever supported with any claims rather than they are just hearsay. It is hard to verify anything that he writes, but among all the historical claims about how Komuso acted, what they did, and how they got their licenses, and what ranks meant, what he writes is something very critical, which seems to be one of the earliest written records of his philosophy. Quote, "Standing upon a truly ancient Japanese foundation, we ought to revive the discipline of the single shakuhachi. I believe that this alone is the way in which the Fuke tradition can truly live in the present age. The Komuso of old, that is, the Fuke sect, appear to have taken bamboo, Zen, and the martial spirit as the pillars of their tradition. Yet, the essential point is not only in outward form, rather all of these elements must be poured into a single bamboo flute. To bow through a single flute is to bow through one's own heart. And outwardly, the sound that flows forth from the bamboo must itself become sutra recitation, seated meditation, and the spirit of the martial way. I call this Shingyo Ikkan, one flute of spiritual practice. And it is for this reason that I call the stream of tradition which transformed the Fuke heritage into the path of Shingyo Ikkan by the name Watazumi. Reflecting upon my own experience, as one who inherited the tradition of the Fuke sect, I too once aspired to restore the Fuke sect itself. When the religious organization laws came into force in April of the year before last, I organized a religious association known as Fuke-zen Ichoken, as one of the lesser teachers within the Zen community, and submitted an application to the authorities jointly with officials of the parent temples and their representatives in Hakata. At the time, I took pride in believing that this was perhaps the first substantial effort in the modern age to restore the religious shakuhachi tradition. However, as I devoted myself more deeply to the single path of bamboo and came to experience a new spiritual horizon, I realized that the restoration of the Fuke sect was not enough. Rather, one must advance beyond that and return to a pure and more ancient Japanese spirit. Therefore, I now devote myself to the path of Shingyo Ikkan, a discipline centered upon training, cultivation, and direct realization. It seems clear to me that this idea of Shingyo Ikkan would later become into his practice of Suijo, and ultimately Suizen by shakuhachi devotees around the world. It's quite remarkable to read these pre-war documents and see history unfold, and watch how these beliefs came into view. However, none of this would have ever been possible without the eccentric nature and tour de force that is and was Watazumi. Part 4. A Master Critiques the Goat. There are figures you encounter in music who immediately force a reassessment of what you think you are hearing. I first heard Watazumi Doso about 15 years ago, at a time when I was still forming my relationship with the shakuhachi itself. The recording was Watazumi and his practical philosophy. My reaction was not analytical. It was immediate and visceral and disarming. The first thought was simply and unfiltered, what the fuck is this? And yet, beneath that shock, there was recognition. The recognition of something inevitable in that sound. It was entrancing, unsettling, and oddly stabilizing at the same time. It did not sit outside of music for me. It expanded what music could mean. Watazumi's tone is difficult to describe without falling into abstractions, because it resists categorization at the level of sound production itself. It feels earthy, raw, and unmanufactured, as if the boundary between breath and environment has thinned to the point of disappearance. Yet there is a quality in his playing that suggests not instrument and performer, but a single human bamboo symbiote expressing itself. Even at its most forceful and abrasive moments, the sound does not feel imposed. It feels inevitable. That word is central. One does not hear excess or lack, one hears occurrence. In that sense, the question of whether his playing is controlled or uncontrolled becomes almost irrelevant. Those categories collapse in this case. There is certainly mastery, extraordinary command of breath, pitch, timing, and phrasing, but it is not presented as control in the usual sense of technique dominating material. Rather, the technique is absorbed into a larger continuity of action. The shakuhachi is not being shaped, it is not being realized in time. To borrow from classical thought, it resembles the principle that the greatest sound is barely heard, and the greatest form has no fixed outline. What appears as spontaneity is not absence of discipline, but discipline so complete that it no longer announces itself. His phrasing reflects the same paradox. It is never formless. It is structurally coherent, often deeply so, but the structure does not feel pre-imposed. Time in his playing is fluid, at moments linear, at moments cyclical, and at moments suspended entirely, but never arbitrary. One can follow it, yet one cannot predict it. The result is a sense that musical time is being generated from within the act of playing rather than applied to it. There is both architecture and emergence, held together without contradiction. From my own perspective as a player who has spent years in Japan and lived closely with the landscape, season, and physical rhythm, I recognize something in his sound that is not easily verbalized. It is not simply nature imitated in music, nor is it an aesthetic representation of the natural world. It is closer to a condition in which the separation between sound and environment has not yet fully formed. The flute does not describe nature, it behaves as if it has never left it. At the same time, there are moments in his later recordings where something shifts. One can sense a withdrawal from the communicative expectations of performance itself. In these instances, the playing can feel less like an unfolding necessity and more like a refusal to engage with the listener on conventional terms. I hesitated to call this a decline because that would assume a standard he no longer is operating within. But I do think that there are points where the intensity becomes self-referential in a way that distances the sound from the immediacy that defines his strongest work. This is where critique becomes necessary, even from within the lineage. It is easy to treat Watazumi as beyond evaluation, but that is not quite accurate. His strongest playing expands the shakuhachi tradition to the point where the instrument no longer functions as an aesthetic object in the usual sense. It becomes a site of confrontation between breath, body, and existence. In weaker moments, however, that confrontation risks flattening into gesture, less revelation, more assertion than revelation has already occurred. Still, there is no one within the shakuhachi world who occupies the same position. Comparisons become approximate at best. Even among myowan practitioners or contemporary concert players, the underlying assumptions about sound, intention, and presentation are fundamentally different. Watazumi does not sit neatly within pre-modern, modern, or postmodern categories. He cuts across them, or perhaps stands entirely outside them. If anything, his work resembles an autonomous system that temporarily uses the shakuhachi as its medium. He also, in later CDs, expanded into other instruments. What remains most striking is not only the sound itself, but the certainty embodied within it. There's no hesitation in the fundamental proposition of his playing. Whether one agrees with it or not, the sound asserts itself as complete in the moment of its existence. That completedness is what makes it both compelling and difficult. It does not invite agreement, it's just honest. From my position, as someone whose lineage and training are directly connected through successive generations of teaching, I do not hear Watazumi as a distant historical figure, nor as an external experimentalist. I hear him as a part of a continuous field of practice that I am still inside of. That proximity removes the luxury of romantic distance. It also removes the option of simple reverence. What remains is attention, careful, sometimes critical, but always engaged. Watazumi Doso is often misunderstood, not because he is obscure, but because he is too often interpreted through frameworks that cannot contain him. The mistake is not in hearing him incorrectly, but in assuming that he is speaking within the same terms as everybody else. He is not. The sound does not argue, it does not explain, it does not persuade, it simply is. And that is why he is and will continue to be one of the greatest shakuhachi players of all time. Part 5. Notes from Yokoyama and Chris J. on the eccentric nature of Watazumi. Katsuya Yokoyama, a disciple who chose his own path. Among all of the Watazumi Doso students, none became more widely known than Katsuya Yokoyama. Yet Yokoyama's relationship with his teacher was not one of blind devotion. His recollections reveal a disciple who stood in awe of Watazumi's abilities while simultaneously wrestling with many of his ideas. Yokoyama first encountered Watazumi's playing as a young teenager through recordings that his mother collected. While he admired many forms of shakuhachi music, hearing Watazumi's version of San-an left a profound impression on him. He later recalled being astonished that music could exist and become consumed by the desire not merely to listen, but to play it himself. After several years of study, Yokoyama finally asked Watazumi to teach him San-an. Watazumi initially refused, believing the student was not yet ready. When Yokoyama insisted that he would be content spending his entire life studying that one piece, Watazumi relented. What followed was characteristic of his teaching style. Rather than moving through a repertoire, he forced students to pursue a single work until it reached a satisfactory level. For more than 3 years, Yokoyama worked almost exclusively on San-an. Yet this period exposed one of the fundamental differences between teacher and student. Yokoyama had fallen in love with the version of San-an he had heard on earlier recordings, but Watazumi's interpretation had evolved dramatically. The piece itself had changed, eventually becoming known as Shunsa. Watazumi wanted his student to learn the newer version, while Yokoyama remained attached to the older one. The resulting tension lasted for years. This disagreement reflected a deep philosophical divide. Watazumi's continually transformed the traditional repertoire, believing that a piece naturally evolves through sincere practice. Yokoyama, however, felt that traditional honkyoku should not be altered by the will of a single individual. If a musician wished to create something new, he believed it should be presented as an original composition rather than a modification of an inherited tradition. Yokoyama's point is that a piece is naturally going to reflect the personality of the player. The score is a skeleton. The piece will change to fit you without effort. Therefore, why change it on purpose? Despite these differences, Yokoyama never lost his respect for his teacher. He considered Watazumi one of the greatest reformers of shakuhachi history, describing him as a founder of a restoration, whose revitalization of honkyoku through breath, sound, and spiritual intensity. At the same time, he resisted becoming a missionary for Watazumi-do, whereas Watazumi hoped to spread his own philosophical path. Yokoyama increasingly felt drawn towards returning shakuhachi to its fuke roots and preserving the traditional honkyoku heritage. What Yokoyama ultimately inherited from Watazumi was not a collection of techniques or even a specific musical style. He summarized the lessons in 2 words: lifelong practice. Watazumi often spoke of taitatsu, acquiring understanding through the body rather than through intellectual explanation. Lessons were frequently sparse. A student might play only a few times before being sent home. Breathing methods, timing, and musical depth were not explained in detail. They had to be discovered through direct experience. According to Yokoyama, this was one of the greatest gifts his teacher gave him, the understanding that genuine knowledge cannot simply be transferred through words. Perhaps the most revealing aspect of Yokoyama's testimony is his discussion of honkyoku itself. He argued that a player should not rely on written notation when performing traditional pieces. For him, honkyoku must become one's own voice. Watazumi had impressed upon him that the hon in honkyoku could be understood as honnin, the person himself, and honne, one's true feelings. A piece is not truly alive until it is eternalized so completely that it emerges directly from the player rather than from the page. Yokoyama also preserved numerous stories illustrating Watazumi's eccentric nature. He described a man who sometimes refused to bring flutes to a scheduled performance, who claimed to have nothing to do with shakuhachi, and who often behaved in ways that bewildered both student and audiences. Yet these stories coexist with accounts of extraordinary discipline, immense breathing control, relentless physical training, and a lifelong commitment to self-cultivation. In the end, Yokoyama viewed Watazumi as both superhuman and deeply human, a figure capable of intimidating those around him while remaining strangely childlike and impossible to hate. In Yokoyama's eyes, Watazumi was a master musician and a practical philosopher whose life embodied an uncompromising search for freedom. Though Yokoyama chose a different path from his teacher in many respects, he never doubted the magnitude of Watazumi's influence. Watazumi had walked the road before him and, as Yokoyama put it, served as the lighthouse illuminating the way. Here are a couple stories from Yokoyama that you might find interesting, translated by Nick Belando. Story 1. From that time, there arose some ardent believers in Watazumi-sensei, in countries such as the United States and France. He even went to the US for a Woodstock rock festival in August of 1969. One of his believers was a director at France's National Broadcast Center who invited Watazumi-sensei to perform. He didn't do anything at all with the shakuhachi. Instead, he said, "I can fart at will," and proceeded to give a demonstration right in front of the audience. Unfortunately, I heard that particular director was let go. Story 2. Here's a well-known story from when he was younger, which takes place during a tea ceremony held at Hakone by Soen Nagagawa Roshi of Ryutakuji, an important Soto Zen temple located in Mishima, Shizuoka. Watazumi-sensei was invited as the guest of honor. When he was given a bowl of tea that Soen Roshi prepared, he gently put his member into the bowl, stirred it around, took a sip, and passed it on to the woman seated next to him. Here you go. Needless to say, she didn't drink it. The woman on the receiving end of the bowl must have had quite the shock, but Soen Roshi simply washed the bowl out and made another cup of tea without saying a word. Story 3. He would show us these ostensibly detached ways of thinking that would make you wonder if he was truly expressing the attainment of ultimate spiritual liberation. Why does he care so much about these things? Even so, he was like some sort of fearsome mythical creature. On the one hand, he would let off a fearful aura that made you feel like he'd eat you if you got too close. On the other hand, he had a sort of childlike innocence that made it impossible to hate him. He was extremely popular with women, apparently appalling so. When my father first stayed over at his house, Watazumi-sensei was laid out, like in the character for River, Kawa, with his wife on one side and a girlfriend on the other. And so my father crawled into bed and slept in the metaphorical mosquito's net. This is a story I most fondly remember. Story 4. This next story comes after Watazumi had left the bamboo behind and focused on his stick training known as bojutsu. As he was putting on his straw sandals in the doorway, I asked Sensei, "Please bring your shakuhachi." He just stood there, let out a grunt, and cocked his head. And a long, uncomfortable pause. During that silence, I considered just canceling the whole thing if he didn't bring his flute. I even went as far as planning to say, "You can go ahead and disown me, that's fine." At long last, he reluctantly climbed up the second floor and brought a bag of 2 shakuhachis. Somehow, we made it to the point of his recital, but he only gave a breath meditation, that is, performed, of Honshirabe, a very short piece, the first one that I had. At least he played this one in its entirety, and then half of Sagariha. Then he talked about Bojutsu. Oh, brother, I thought to myself. Around that time, Watazumi-sensei had been living like a recluse. It was the period where he would say, "I have nothing to do with shakuhachi." It felt like you couldn't even say the sha of shakuhachi when you were around him. However, I wanted more people, even one more, to hear his incredible music. Of course, this was for the sake of my own study as well. So when talk of making recording would flutter in, I put all my effort into making it happen. For those interested in the life and legacy of Watazumi Doso Roshi, few individuals are better positioned to offer first-hand insight than Chris J., a longtime resident of Japan, an ordained Zen monk, and a shakuhachi player himself. Chris first traveled there in 1970 to study shakuhachi and immerse himself in the Japanese culture. His journey led him through periods of training in Zen monasteries, where he developed a deep understanding of both the language and the spiritual traditions that shape many aspects of Japanese life. Through these experiences, Chris eventually formed a close association with Watazumi, serving as one of his translators and helping bridge the gap between enigmatic master and international audiences. His voice can be heard in some of the rare surviving footage of Watazumi, providing English narration and translation for the master's explanation. Having witnessed Watazumi's teachings, personality, and daily life firsthand, Chris offers a rare perspective on one of the most influential and misunderstood figures in the history of shakuhachi. I hope you enjoy these interview clips. Chris, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yes, my pleasure.
So,
Really
of
happy to
course,
have this conversation.
absolutely. So, we're here to talk about Watazumi, but I actually want to start with you. So, how did you first become interested in Japan and Japanese culture?
Well, I was at Oberlin College in Ohio. I was in the Conservatory of Music, and I was going to be a trumpet player. I've been playing trumpet since the third grade. And this was in the late 60s, and we all were doing the kind of things that people, sort of advanced hippie type characters did. Just a minute, somebody. We were doing the kinds of things that we did in the late '60s, which is taking a lot of LSD, and that was the era when like Steve Jobs took LSD and went to India and spent a year.
Mm-hmm.
So, I took some LSD and I was reading, I happened to have at hand a Daisetsu Suzuki book, Zen and Japanese Culture.
Mm-hmm.
And in that book, there were, these beautiful paintings, Zen sumie, with the poems. And as the LSD wore on, I thought, gosh, I could understand that. That's exactly I got it. And then, of course, the LSD wore off, and I didn't get it anymore. And
Mm-hmm.
to me, it was actually a really painful experience because there was that blissful sense that when you really understand non-duality, you understand the play of non-duality, and you understand how Buddhism is the path that actually it's not an ism, it's a path that actually helps you recognize non-duality, which is the basic
Mm-hmm.
nature of what is.
Mm-hmm.
Yet our nature is divorced from that by the very, fact of our own ignorance.
Mm-hmm.
And to get that glimpse was so blissful. And it reminded me of this Christian mystic that I had read. His name is Heinrich Suso. And Heinrich Suso had a very similar experience. This is back in the medieval days. He had a
Mm-hmm.
very similar experience. And he said that after that experience, he felt like a vase that had contained a precious ointment, but now all that remained was the perfume. And that's
Mm.
exactly how I felt. And so I said, I was at the end of my junior year at Oberlin. I said, okay, that's it, I'm going. So that summer, I left and went to Japan, not knowing how long I was going to stay, but my intention was to become a Zen monk and to be able
Mm-hmm.
to have that experience in such a way that it would stay and not leave.
Mm-hmm.
It would not be an impermanent experience. So that summer, then I think it was in July or early August, I flew to Japan and was to Kyoto, and I had a introduction to Abbot Nandre Kobori in the Ryokoin sub-temple of Daitokuji,
Mm.
Daitokuji main temple in Kyoto. Was the northern gate of the Rinzai temples. And one thing turned into another. He accepted me as a young American student, and I said to him, I want to be a Zen monk. And he looked at me and laughed, and he said, "Well, learn Japanese." He said, "Because we're not going to train you. We're not going to do any allowance for you being a foreigner. You're going to have to do it exactly as a Japanese young
Mm.
disciple would." And so I immediately enrolled in the Japanese language school, Kyoto Nihongo Gakko, down in Chuoku, I think it was in Kyoto, and studied as hard as I possibly could the language,
Mm.
and Abbot Kobori invited me to live in the temple after about 6 months. And in the temple, you basically work. You clean gardens and you pull weeds, and nobody talks about Zen.
Mm-hmm.
There's no talk about Zen at all. It's not like the Tibetans who will do lots of philosophy and so on and so forth. Zen people say just work, eat, work, shit, and sit. Sit zazen. And
Chop wood,
so,
carry water. Or my more favorite, chop water, carry wood.
yeah, that one too.
Yeah.
Because if you are beginning to have some insight into non-duality, then the chop water, carry wood might actually make sense. The thing is that, as a young disciple, you just basically keep your mouth shut and you watch and you listen and you learn how to chant the sutras and do the services and so on like that. You learn how to comport yourself in a temple, and you learn how to wear waraji, the straw sandals, and wear robes and kimonos and so on like that. And you learn how to move. You learn how your body should move in that environment. It's not like careless Americans, with all elbows here and dropping this and that. You really need to be precise with your movements and very, very quiet about it. And so, 4 years actually in Abbot Kobordi's temple. Then he sent me to the Simmon Dojo, the training monastery, where that's where the rough Zen training that you read about, being beaten with a stick and so on like that,
Hmm.
where you do the koan studies with the Roshi, and the Roshi is tough as nail. Our Roshi had been was from Myoshinji. And Myoshin was known as the toughest of the monasteries.
Hmm.
So he was the seventh disciple of the great Bon Ken Roshi, and he had basically received the Inca Shonin, the transmission
Yeah,
to
Dharma
teach.
transmission.
And so he was then now the Roshi of our monastery. So I stayed there for 3 years. And at the end of that 3 years, I just really decided that I really didn't want to be a professional Zen monk. I mean, I would have had to stay another 7 or 10 years. Actually, the only one of us who really did. There's three of us. There was
Mm.
Raymond Coffin, who was 2 years ahead of me. And he had left the monastery and went back to Texas, and he ended up dying from AIDS. I think he got a blood
Mm.
transfusion before anybody knew what AIDS was.
Mm.
And then there was me, and then the one who actually lasted the entire duration and became a Roshi in his own right
Mm.
is Victor Hori, Victor Sogen Hori, or Victor Genyu Hori, I think they called him Genyu,
Mm.
Genyu Zenji, or Sogen Zenji. And so, and Victor Hori still is alive today. He's sort of retired as a Roshi. He was a Roshi at the One Drop Zendo and so on. Was also a professor at McGill University. So,
Oh,
anyways,
interesting.
that was that was sort of those days in Kyoto in the early 70s.
But it didn't end there for you because you got into the Shakuhachi world as well and you started learning that. And so, what was the Shakuhachi world like when you first arrived and when you were starting getting involved in that stuff?
Well, one summer before I went to the monastery, I was able to take 3 weeks off, or 2 or 3 weeks off, I can't remember. And there's a bunch of gaijin who were going out to Shodoshima in the Seto Naikai, and to be camp counselors for this camp, this high school camp. And so we were counselors. So I went
Mm.
out there sort of as sort of just as a buddy of the people out there. And there was one guy was sitting out on a rock playing a shakuhachi, sort of sitting out on a rock over the ocean, with the waves coming in, playing the shakuhachi. So I heard that and I said, that's what I want to play.
Mm.
And not that I can't remember even his name, but I just remember the sound of his shakuhachi against the ocean. And, I've been in a conservatory of music playing the trumpet, and when I
Yeah.
left for Japan, I sold my trumpets so that I could, actually I had three of them. I sold two, and when a musician sells your axe, you kind of know it's over. And
Oh,
I
yeah.
really didn't want to play the trumpet anymore. But when I wanted to do something musically, and so when I heard that, I said, okay, that's it, that's the one. So then, as a monk, every Kaisan-ki, Kaisan is the Founder's Day, there would be a great, huge ceremony, and all the abbots would come to the main hondo, the center of the ceremonial center of Daitokuji Monastery. And into that came three shakuhachi players. One of them was Ozawa Seizon,
Hmm.
who became later known as Ozawa Zetsugai. And they would play, the shakuhachi. And the reason is because one of the old abbots, old founders of Daitokuji also played the shakuhachi, and so that's why they would invite the shakuhachi players. And who was that? Ikkyu Zenji, I think it was. Ikkyu
Yeah, the
Zenji's.
legend. Yeah,
Yeah,
there's a lot of mystery behind that for the shakuhachi and what he played. But
yeah.
yeah, but that's interesting.
So Ikkyu Zenji's Ohaka, his grave, is in one of the sub-temples of Daitokuji. It's really interesting because his grave, you know how the Japanese gravestones will often look.
Hmm.
He had his grave carved, so it's a wooden thing with a great big hole in it. And asked what the hole represents. He says, Daiku, you know, emptiness, the great emptiness. And so he wanted people to look at the grave and actually get some realization of what, you know, shunyata or emptiness is actually trying to point to, particularly in the context of Zen practice.
Mm.
So at any rate, the Ozawa Seizan and the three, his probably two disciples, I can't remember, came and they played some honkyoku during that particular ceremony, and so I thought, so I took note, and I was still a young monk at that point, and I thought, okay, well, if when I leave the monastery, if I ever do, I'll go and knock on his door and see if he'll teach me.
Yeah.
And so, after only 3 years in the monastery, I left, and it was about maybe 3 or 4 months later that I was able to connect with Ozawa Seizan and actually become his student. Now, before that, before I even went to the monastery, for one anecdote I forgot, there was a shakuhachi teacher in Kyoto named Genpu Sensei.
Hmm.
And Genpu Sensei had this long white beard, and he played these long shakuhachis, you know, big
Hmm.
long ones. He'd have to reach down to get the row. And I think that, you know, the guy I heard sitting out on the rock, I think he was a student of Genpu. So I had become, after I left the monastery, no, I'm sorry, before I went to the monastery, I had become a student of Genpu Sensei. And being a student of his basically meant we would go and take bottles of sake and get him as drunk as possible. And he would play Hamabe no Yo, and so, you know, songs like Aritsuki Yo, you know, that one.
Oh
He would
yeah,
play
yeah.
that on his shakuhachi, and we would all play along with it and so on like that. But you know, Genpu Sensei was not really, you know, didn't quite have the lineage. You know, I was always so deeply interested in lineage. You know, and making
Mm-hmm.
sure that, you know, the lineage that I was studying was not just some odd character. And Genpu Sensei, unfortunately, sort of fit, in, at least in my estimation, my own ignorance, he fit into the realm of odd character.
Hmm.
So anyway, after I left the monastery, I studied with Ozawa Seizan, and he gave me a shakuhachi, and, you know, I learned to play, and, you know, I played. I think I was there in Japan for another 3 years after that, and I finished all of the. He taught me all of the Meian Honkyoku all the way to the end, to the last volume, and I think I ended up with an Okuden, but I never felt like I had the real. You know, I never really felt like I had the real power of a Fukeshu shakuhachi player, so I never sat for the Meikyo Kaiden.
Mm-hmm.
And but I do have. I remember. I think I have the Okuden certificate downstairs in my files somewhere. It's really sort of nostalgic in a certain way. But at any rate, I came back to the U.S. in 1980, and I put together a tape of shakuhachi and piano with a friend of mine. This is back before digital recording, and so the quality of the recording was really not so great. But then, one by one, my shakuhachis split. And so I had to rescue them in emergency rescue, putting into the ER, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
to repair them and so on like that. And only one of them really lasted. The others split beyond repair. But that was when I was living in New York City, and the steam heat came on in the
That'll do it.
and I was busy trying to be a writer. I was in an MFA in writing program at Goddard College in Vermont, and, you know, busy writing. And in my apartment, I was typing away, and boom, I heard this crack. You know, I thought, oh God, that's the shakuhachi, and it was the most
Mm-hmm.
horrible sound in the world. At any rate, that's sort of a bit of my background, and then.
Yeah. So then the next logical question is, how did you first get introduced to Watazumi?
So I was living in New York, and if you've lived in Kyoto for 10 years, New York is a pretty mean and tough place to be, and a pretty foreign place to be,
Hmm.
particularly during in 1980 when, crime was still strong and so on and so forth like that.
Hmm.
You know, um, I remember this wonderful anecdote. I was living on 180th and Broadway, and there was this old lady walking along the street. An old lady, was bent over carrying a purse like this. Some young kid came and snagged her purse, knocked her over, and and ran away with her purse. And so I went to see if the lady was okay. She was okay. I ran after the guy. I got the purse back, got the, like that. I grabbed the guy and I dragged him into a synagogue. And I say, we're calling the cops. The only reason synagogue was because it was right there.
Hmm.
And so we called somebody called the cops, and in comes the rabbi. And the rabbi looked at both of us and he said, you bring so much suffering into the world. I thought, oh, what a wise man. This extraordinarily wise man. Anyway, the cops came and let the kid go, and the old lady was injured. She had to go, doctor and get repaired and so on like that. But it was interesting. It was a tough place to be as a young kid, 10 years in Kyoto and then moving to New York City.
Hmm.
There's a private reason I was there, but you don't need to get into that. But along the way, I got contacted by the Zen Arts Center, which I think now is called the Zen Mountain Monastery. John Daido Lori was the Roshi there. He had been a student of Maizumi Roshi, and so they said we need somebody to come up and translate and do some interpreting, and we don't know anybody who speaks Japanese. And I was kind of desperate to get out of New York City at that point. So I said, well, I can't. They said, we can't pay you anything. I said, okay, here's my price for doing this is that find me a place to live and find me a job. Any job. So then I'll come and I'll come in, and so they found me a job as like a dishwasher in the local French restaurant, but that was an interesting thing. I ended up as a sous chef there. But all right, so in comes Watazumi-do Doso Roshi, and wow, what a wow.
Yeah, what was that? What was that first conversation like? It's like, hello, I'm your translator.
Well, I knew how to act.
Hmm.
Having been beaten in the monastery for so many years, and knowing how to keep my head down and my mouth shut, and how to keep my head low, and also how to, because I'm a bit of an extrovert, I knew how to be sort of subtly engaging in a certain way, and my Japanese in those days was really good.
Hmm.
So I could, I used to be able to fool a taxi driver in the dark. Thinking that, the taxi driver would turn around, "Kaiji," like that. As so I was still good in those days. I'm no good anymore. I can speak kitchen Japanese, but in those days I was really good. And I think what Dosa Roshi himself was a little concerned about how he was going to communicate with Americans. Yeah, Dosa Roshi had this. It's really interesting. I was thinking, how would I talk about him? How would I even introduce him?
Like,
I
did you
mean,
have an image or a reputation of him beforehand?
no, I had no idea who he was. They said he was the trainer of the Imperial National Guard and a living National Treasure Shakuhachi player. That's what I was told. And I had no idea who he was. When I was a student of Ozawa Seizon, we were always close to the Meionji time and situation there. And so, I never, heard of Watazumi-do Doso Roshi when I was in Japan.
Hmm.
So this is my first time to meet him. But in Central, I was thinking about it. He really was, for lack of a better word, the crazy yogic tradition that you often see, not often, but occasionally in Central Asia. in the Bon cultures or the Vajrayana cultures of Tibet, or in the Vajrayana Mahayana cultures in India, I'm sorry, in China, you would see these crazy yogis.
Hmm.
Like at least in the Zen world, it's Hanzan and Jittoku. The cold mountain poems. Translated so beautifully by Gary Snyder and I think Red Pine and so on. But he really sort of was in that mold, and what that mold is about, it's not a mold, I'm sorry, what that is about is really going against the current accepted establishment of what Buddhism should be about. That gets entrenched in the temples, and
Hmm.
it's in Buddhism they're very proud of lineage, goes back to the Buddha, from teacher to student, teacher to student, teacher to student. And so what they do is they've ended up creating these big sort of bureaucratic lineages,
Hmm.
and the great, mountain monasteries and of all the sects in Japan have this huge bureaucracy associated with them. And he loved to take the piss out of those kind of people. He just loved to take the piss out of them. And this goes very, very much in the style of these, for lack of a better word, these crazy yogic style, in Asia.
Yeah, it
This is
reminds me a lot of the Tang Dynasty Hebei Dao monks,
yeah,
like Rinzai himself,
yeah,
like Pu Hua, like Fuke,
yeah,
just going against the grain, flipping tables, like eating raw vegetables in the street.
yeah,
That's really, what he was like from
yeah,
what all I've heard him speak and how he's acted.
yeah. I mean, there's one story of Daito Kokushi, the founder of Daitokuji, my monastery. He was a kokushi, a national teacher,
Hmm.
designated by the emperor. And so once he was invited to a danka, not danka, no, what is danka? That's Tibetan. As a what's the Japanese word? A supporter, someone who supports the monastery, does the financial support. He was invited to, for a big, dinner. And so he went, and before he knocked on the door, he took off his ceremonial robes, folded them up, and left them on the doorstep, knocked on the door, and walked away. And they were, of course, deeply insulted. And they said, "Why did you possibly do that?" And he said, "Well, you didn't want to invite me. You wanted to invite my robes. There they were." So it's this type of going against the. I mean, this style is what he embodied so strongly,
Absolutely.
and
Absolutely. And I think that that's where part of like the crazy madman idea comes from. But it's what's really fascinating about it is that this is actually quite a long tradition or lineage, if we may, that's been going on since before even the Tang Dynasty.
yeah, absolutely, yes, indeed.
So, but this introduction here and you translating for him, it didn't stop there. The relationships develops and you guys become friends. And so, how did that happen?
Well, I knew how to be a disciple. I was good at being a disciple, and so I very much acted like a disciple, and he had all, because he was sort of teaching me, and the more he taught me, the more I just sort of responded with the enthusiasm. Like for instance, I remember this was in Mount Tremper, and like a crossroads in the Catskills is where the Zen Mountain Monastery is. We would get out on the road at like 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, and he would be in his fundoshi, and this tied up underwear, and he'd have a bow, the long jo, I guess they would call it, that is
Yeah.
about a dowel. We had to get him one. We got him a hardwood dowel that I can't remember, it was 8 feet or 12 feet or something like that. We went to the hardware store or lumber store and got this thing, and he would spin it around like that, and he was really, really big on the the internal yogas, for lack of a better word, the internal yoga of the breath.
Hmm.
And he would talk about the different kinds of breath. There's the rough breath, the subtle breath, the ordinary breath, and so on like that. And he would, really talk about it as you provoke that by moving the big muscles in your body. Then you
Hmm.
can end up moving the finer muscles. And he was always talking about moving the fingers, in different directions, and moving the toes in different directions. And he would use this stick. It was kind of like lunging, in a martial arts style, because he was a martial arts, instructor or teacher for the Imperial National Guard, but it was very much banging on his back and rubbing like that, and he'd rub up and down his shins and his calves and so on like that on both sides and like this, and really giving his body a full workout. It was very similar to the sort of Tibetan, what they call the true core yogas, in the more secret Tibetan yogas, they do this sort of thing, they're going up and down the arms and so on like this. Is basically what he was doing. And this was a school or a technique that he probably saw others using the bow as a martial arts, but he decided to basically develop it as a way of of making his breath stronger. Because he was all about health and breath. It was interesting. His wife told me that he was chimbata. He was basically one leg was shorter than the other by
Yeah.
an inch or so. So chimbata, of course, means a cripple or a crip, basically.
Yeah.
In Japanese, sort of high school language. So basically, he would without all this, he would walk with a limp because one leg was shorter than the other. So he was fanatical about health.
Hmm.
He would just fanatical about health, and when he would hear that one of his colleagues from or his age had died, he would say, "I'm better than he was. He died. I'm still alive." Like that. It was this, he was so, I'm going to outlast them all, and he, it comes from the gut, I remember in the talk that I gave, he was talking about, your sound has to come from your balls.
Hmm.
And so, basically he had this, deep belly, growl like this. And of course, he is one of the things that that you can't be in a Japanese monastery without learning the growl,
Hmm.
because that's the way all the roshis, at least the wrathful ones, will communicate like that.
Now,
And if you don't chant that way, they kick you. And so he definitely had that kind of depth in his voice. It's just really something.
what I find what's really hard. So I've translated a fair number of things from Watazumi, and he was lived in a transitional time where they were still using the old style Japanese, and then that got reformed after GHQ. But even when we find like the audio recordings of him in 1940, 1950, and so on, when he speaks, he's sometimes his speech is very cryptic and it's very difficult to translate. Do you remember having struggles with trying to understand what he was actually meaning? Or
Yes, absolutely.
Mhm.
Absolutely, I did. And, he would give, lectures in different places. Often, mostly it was usually the same lecture. And so I sort of got better at figuring out what he was saying.
Mhm.
You know, the first few times I translated, I think I probably got about 60% of what he was, but I was pretending like I understood everything.
Mm.
So not such a professional in that regard as myself as a translator. But no, I found it a bit difficult to understand him. I remember once we got drunk with Maizumi Roshi, and we got very, very, very drunk. And it was just really, really, and it was easier to understand him then.
For someone who's so fanatic about health, I'm surprised that he would let him drink himself that much.
Well, he didn't drink. He was not a drunk. It's just
Hmm.
if you're gonna drink, drink. You know,
Oh, yeah,
it's
okay.
just, if you're gonna play, play. If you're gonna work, work. You know, it's that kind of, okay, I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna isshokenmei ni, saigo made, boom. It's gonna really, just do it full bore.
Hmm.
And the next day he was, I was, hung over like a mess. He was up and bright. What's the problem? There was an alchemical ability with him to, this, how in alchemy they talk about transmuting.
Hmm.
When
Yeah.
he had this kind of internal energy that could take poison and transmute it. It's interesting. That image is really an interesting one. And in the Hinayana, they say, if you see a poisonous plant, they say avoid it. In the Mahayana, they say, okay, well, if you see a poisonous plant, then put a fence around it so no sentient beings would have to suffer as a result of ingesting this plant. In the Vajrayana, or the Mantrayana, the sort of the secret Vajrayana, they take the plant and ingest it and it transmute it into medicine. And that's kind of the way he was.
Hmm.
He didn't have preferences for this or that he was not able to transmute,
Hmm.
that he was not able to consume thoroughly.
So we're going to get back to more of the personal stories in a little bit, but I do want to talk about Watazumi the musician. And I would like you to tell us just a little bit about his playing and, being close up and personal and hearing it.
Like nothing I'd ever heard. Like nothing I'd ever heard or ever heard again. I played for him my little Ishaku Hasun that I was always Zetsugai one. I didn't get through half of Choshi, but he said, no. And he said, let me play for you. And so, he picked up one of the, his flutes, jogu, he would call them suijo dogu, suijo dogu is blowing tools, he didn't call them flutes. He called them jogu, and so he would these things are long, thick, they're like a big chunk of a tree, and like this, and I'd never heard anything like that, and it was really hard for me to, after all the years I had done the Meian Honkyoku, to really get a sense of how what he was playing had any relation at all to the Meian Honkyoku.
Hmm.
He played Kyorei once, I think, and it didn't sound like any Kyorei I'd ever heard, but it was the way he played,
Hmm.
and it expressed. I was going back to that talk that he gave. You can read the transcription of it on the you know
Komuso.com.
yeah, Komusuda International Shakuhachi thing. Um, he said, when you play music, four kinds of breathings: rough breathing, strong breathing, soft breathing, and weak breathing. That's what he was up to. You know, he was not after the beautiful shakuhachi sound or even the powerful shakuhachi sound that, to have an effect. He was interested in he was interested in Zen realization,
Mm.
and even not even Zen anymore.
Mm.
He was interested in the realization of the Dharmata, or the Dharmadhatu, Dharmakaya. He was really, this was way beyond anything that ordinary Buddhists in Japan
Mm.
would be thinking of, with their institutional requirements and their bureaucratic processes and so on like that. He was interested in going directly to the source. He wanted to grab the source at its root. And all of his playing had to do with realizing that and expressing that. I'd never heard shakuhachi like that before, and
It's very interesting you say that. So I have a collection of his early writings from that are pre-war, and in there, in one of his, he has this one that's called Komuso Menkyo. Mukashi, ima to mukashi, konjaku.
hmm,
And he says there, so Komuso licensing then and now. And in there, on the last installment of this 7-part article, he says, my practice goes beyond what the Fuke players were trying to do. And so I call this practice Shingyo Ikkan, one flute of spiritual practice.
Yep.
And at the end, he says, "Therefore, I devote myself to this path of Shingyo Ikan as a discipline centered upon training, cultivation, and direct realization."
That's exactly it. And he was still doing that when I met him.
And it just seems that he goes by different names, right? I think he just updates the terminology over time, because I don't see him ever using that word later, but it became Suizhou. And instead, even it's really interesting. Right before he would say, like, he wouldn't say, "I'm going to perform," like "ensou suru," "ensou itashimasu." Would never say that. He would say, "Hon shirabe o suijou itashimasu." I'm going to concentrate and breathe the
Mhm.
work hon shirabe.
Yep. Exactly. Again, the breath. And in the study of Tibetan Vajrayana, anytime we have thoughts, anytime we make noise with our mouths or otherwise, it's all there's the outer, inner, and secret. There's the outer, which is the voice. There's the inner, which is the movement of the breath. And there's the secret, which is the movement of the thoughts in the mind. This is all the breathing. And the breathing is the that's called the prana, in Sanskrit. This is really the gateway that he used to realization, and it's a gateway for many great yogis of various different Buddhist traditions. They'll do the Tunmo practices and so on. It's all based on the breath. Well, he had this powerful, powerful breathing. And for him, enacting the breath was a way of pointing directly to the nature of the mind, which is what he was really going. This is the nature of mind has this vast expanse of non-duality, which is our real situation. And it's actually going back to Heinrich Suso. That's what Heinrich Suso saw also.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know.
What would you say is the most unique thing about his sound that the recordings do not do justice to?
The powerful breath, yeah, the sort of the vibration of the floor, the
Oh, yeah.
floorboards, you know, the just the shocking sound that would almost scare you when you first heard it. You know, powerful. It's interesting because he said that the way he trained to be able to do that was to. He said there's two ways to train. You can go out to the forest, and that way you can train for the soft breathing. But if you really want to train the power of your breathing, you go out and sit by a locomotive train, and you compete with it. So so I've said, we used to live in Emeryville area in the Bay Area, and there's train tracks that come through, and these trains that come through all the time. And we used to go sit there and have breakfast sometimes. This is years later after I was married, and I used to think about that. I used to think, God, if I were to take my shakuhachi and go out next to that locomotive sitting on the track that's going, just sort of sitting there like that, and compete with that. And that's what he had done. And that's why his breath was so powerful. I don't think yeah, of course the recordings do what they can. We didn't have digital recordings in those days, or digital remastering, or digital mastering, I should say. And so it doesn't, the whole fidelity is not there. But I think you can, get a sense of how different he was from any other quote shakuhachi player that you would have ever seen before. Again, he was not interested in performance as a musician. He was interested in manifesting realization through his breath. That's what he was interested in, and it was powerful when he did.
And that really tackles the next two questions I had written out, which both of them are, what did he value most in shakuhachi playing? And I think we can just say as a form of direct realization through that breath chakra.
Yeah,
And then how did his approach differ from other major players of the period? It's that he's just not interested in performance. It's
yeah,
much more of his own spiritual path.
yeah.
Now, the one thing that I find, when at least I read Watazumi's philosophy, I don't find anything incredibly groundbreaking in it, like nothing that's not ever been written before. So I do want to talk a little bit about his practical philosophy and what that meant to him. And I don't know if you can talk about that at all.
Okay. Can you tell me more? What do you mean?
So, like, how would you describe his overall philosophy of life?
Well, overall philosophy of life, God, philosophy is, it's so, I don't even think he thought about that. His idea was to go against the mainstream and to rail against it and so caustic and so critical of the mainstream, so caustic. And then in his own personal way, he would act that way also, demonstrating that he is not going to get caught up in ordinary, how does that prayer go? There's this wonderful prayer. Let me get this. I was reading it earlier this morning. It says, "At all times and in all circumstances, may the wish to conform to conventional expectations not arise for even an instant. If, due to the power of strong habits, such deluded intentions occur, may they not succeed." This was his.
That sounds about right.
That was written by Jingmei Lingpa, one of the great Turtan treasure revealers of Tibet.
Mm-hmm.
And that's sort of our favorite aspiration prayer that he wrote. But may, if I have any conventional expectations at all, may they not succeed.
One of my favorite Zen stories is one of the Zen stories about it's a koan of the fan. Like the Roshi gives the fan to one of his students, and the fan opens it up and he fans himself. And he says, "No good." Takes the fan and gives it to the next student, and the student takes the fan. He closes it and he scratches his back, and he goes, "Not bad." Takes the fan from him, he gives it to the third student. The third student opens it, backs up, puts the mochi on top of it, and hands it back to the teacher. He goes, "You know very well." And the whole entire idea, of course, we know that a fan can fan ourselves, right? And it's what it's designed for. But the student then breaks the convention, and he then scratches his own back, and he goes, "Wow, yeah, you're thinking outside the convention, but you're still serving yourself." But the third student gets it, where he says, "How can I use this to serve others?" And so I can see a lot of that, wanting to break away from the convention of these sort of things. But I have a hard time finding out where Watazumi really roots all of his actions. Like, it's not really Zen. It's not just the physical training. It's not, nature. But I do see that there's something else that's going on there that I haven't really just picked up on. And I think you're getting more into that tantric tradition that I'm just not familiar with, where I think he was more in tune with it in his time.
Exactly. Understand that he became a Roshi before any of this.
Mm-hmm.
So, Rinzai training is, it is not easy. There's no heat in the winter. You're allowed three layers of cotton. There's no wool. There's no, down parkas.
Mm-hmm.
And my own Roshi, the first Kobori Nandre Osho, when he was a young monk, during the Rohatsu session, the big session of the first 8 days of December, Rohatsu, that's it, December 8th, which celebrates the enlightenment of the Buddha. He would go during the 1 hour at night between 12 a.m. and 1 a.m. that you're allowed to doze. He would go out to the pond and immerse himself in the pond. This is in December. It's fucking cold.
Yes, it is.
Fucking cold.
Yeah.
From Kyoto.
Oh, yeah. -1, -2 degrees.
So he would go out and robes off into the pond and sit there like this. And he said the most exquisite sound he ever heard was the sound of the. He would sit motionless, was the sound of the ice beginning to reform around his head, so he could hear the crickling of the ice very subtly. Is the most extraordinary sound. So these guys, you can't do that kind of thing if you don't have inner heat yoga and know how to do it. And that is, it's taught in a more systemized way in the Tibetan tradition, but in the Japanese Zen tradition, it's also taught very secretly. I never ran into those teachings. I never received any teachings like that myself. But reading Meido Roshi's book about this, the guy lives in what it was Wisconsin, is it?
Yes.
And also remembering what Abbot Kobordi had told me about that experience, I realized that that sort of thing exists. What happens when you do that? The world of humans no longer understands you,
Hmm.
and one of the poems goes, "Outcast by humans, found
Mm.
by dogs, obtained by the gods." It's the world of humans no longer understands you. So when I relate that kind of practice tradition to Doso Roshi, I mean he not only went through the entire Zen training, all of the koans, which takes about 15 years to do. And because then after you finish the koans, then you have to spend some number of years studying and writing poetry and so on like that. And so he completed all of that, and just that was a good start. you
Yeah,
know.
and
So from that, after that, then he is. I mean, I don't know what monastery he was at,
yeah,
but
that's this is
if
we
indeed he had done the full Zen training, he would have done all that before embarking on this or
and
maybe not. I just don't know,
and
but.
that's one of the questions that I also posed earlier in this video. Of course, you haven't seen it yet because it's not made, but for everybody in the future, that there is no record of his monastery training or his Inka Shome. But if he was to finish it, he would have finished it in 4 years.
Yeah, well, that's certainly possible.
Yeah, I mean, incredibly difficult, but not impossible.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on what lineage he would have studied. In my particular lineage, the Myoshin lineage that I was with, there was 548 or something koans. Victor Hori writes about that in his book Zen Sand. He actually talks about that. Victor Hori again is the only one of us who amounted to anything. He lasted. And he wrote about that. I think it's 540 some koans, which just takes time to get through.
Yeah,
It,
absolutely.
maybe he can pass one koan per day, but it took all of us Shinto, the first year monks. It took us all about 6 months to pass our first koan.
Hmm.
So, and who knows? I mean, I just can't. And in what realm was this? Dosa Roshi was the kind of person who may not have been encumbered by only the human realm. So he was that kind of person. Again, outcast by humans, found by dogs, obtained by the gods. He who knows where he went for this training.
Oh,
But
absolutely.
I do have to say that he certainly he you know he plugged into the essential power of the universe, and you could hear it in his breath, and again, your question earlier about what it sound like, that's what it sounded like.
Are there, and I don't know how many people you've talked to that are Watazumi fans that you've talked to about, but are there any common misconceptions about his philosophy that you would like to correct?
Well, nobody would understand it. I wouldn't even call it philosophy, because philosophy
Yeah, yeah, it's a
suggests that there's going to be a discussion.
yeah, or a logic behind it.
There's no discussion with him. He was just pure and raw and highly sophisticated at the same time.
Do you think that there's been a misunderstanding or mythologizing about him over the years?
I don't know. I've been out of the yeah. I guess when I see, right before our conversation this morning, I spent a couple of hours perusing what people say about him on the internet. I thought I scratched my head and I thought, oh, really? Oh.
Hmm.
And people would say this and that, and to a certain extent, he was a bit of a showman, quite honestly. So he probably wouldn't mind having a lot of people misunderstanding him.
Sure.
He
You
was
know,
a show. He was a showman. I do have to say.
yeah.
I do have to say yeah. Yeah.
I remember before our conversation, I had sent you a story of him, and I said, "Is this legit?" And you kind of cocked your head a little bit, and you said, "I wouldn't put it past him." And that was about him running 9 hours, like, half naked across Tokyo. And I think that's just the sort of thing, is that a lot of times when I do read some of the mythological stories, I started thinking, like, there's no way, and I go, but it's Watazumi. Maybe,
Yeah. Yeah, that may
maybe.
be. Again, I know the need that we have to to only report those things which are verifiable. But what I can verify is this: his diet.
Oh yes, and this goes. So let me transition us into that, because I would love to ask you this next question. So we know just by this conversation alone that Watazumi was known as a very eccentric figure, the tour de force of eccentric people. Do you have any stories that capture his personality?
Well, for instance, his the diet. The Zen Art Center, the Zen Mountain Monastery, whatever it's called. Bless their hearts, they did all they could to serve him, prepare in advance, not knowing what he would like and so on and so forth. They're vegetarian and whatnot. And but when he came, all he wanted to eat was bananas. So they had to go out and get a trunk full of bananas in the car, and they ran through one trunk, and they had to go get another trunk full of. His wife was there. He was married. He was married, and his wife said, "Oh, tie in this name, tie in this name." She said, and before the banana, it was haksai, the
Oh
Chinese
man.
cabbage, and she said, fortunately, he didn't have an eye for the women. Because if he did, oh, that would have been really tie-in. It's so and she was barely run around keeping up with him and making sure that he was okay, and then just his kimono was tied on right and whatnot. But another story about him, which is definitely true, was the way he bundled his jogu, for traveling. You would think, living national treasure traveling with his treasured flutes, would put them in cases and, with foam around the cases and so on. No, not him. He had this canvas bag, and he threw them in this canvas bag and wrapped like a karate belt around, and just tied it like that, and then sent it through the, checked baggage. And whatever. I said, well, don't you worry that they're going to get destroyed or going to lose it? Nah, if they get destroyed, that's okay. I got new ones. Who cares? That kind of thing. And there was one of the sponsors of his trip there was a American composer named Pauline Oliveras,
Yes.
and you can probably read about Pauline.
Which everybody should. Very incredible accordion player, very accomplished composer. Our American, living national treasure, as it would be for
So,
composition.
so the job that they found me was as her secretary. That
Oh,
was my
interesting.
that was my first job, and so that was there's because I had been working for like Mitsubishi Shoshu or something like that in New York City. I just hated it. I was a translator interpreter for them, and I hated it. And so anyway, I said, well, if you know how to work in that kind of city, you can be her secretary. So I became Pauline's secretary, and kind of she considered me her student also.
Hmm.
She actually introduced me. She dragged me and introduced me to the 16th Karmapa, and that was I will forever be grateful to her for her taking me there. That's just fantastic. But Pauline was a like a black belt karate, and Pauline used to have this thing called scum, society to cut up men. Like she was a radical lesbian, hated men. But as she got older, she realized that that kind of immaturity was just it was just a sign of her own immaturity, out in the world. And that as she became more famous, so she learned karate and became this black belt in karate. So she really wanted to show Doso Roshi her kata, her form, So dutifully, Doso Roshi went up to her A-frame that she had built at the Zen Art Center, and so she began demonstrating her kata like that. And I could see that Doso Roshi was trying to be polite. Um, she's the trainer for the Imperial National Guard. And then a day or so later, he kind of grumbled to me. "Ah, so I had to look at that heta nakata."
Hitanakata, by the way, means that like awful form.
Yeah, this poor quality or awful form like that. But I don't think it's so much of a comment on her as is a comment on that whole tradition that she was trying to be. She's so proud of her
Hmm.
accomplishment. And but she really she loved Doso Roshi, and she also became a student. As I think I told you, he had written out for me by the end of the 3 weeks that we were together. He had written out for me on a piece of notebook paper a declaration of making me his disciple,
Mm.
and I think he did that for Pauline also.
Mm.
And the you know I've moved so many times since then, and I had this box of stuff that of my writing from when I was an MFA in writing and the articles I
Hmm.
published in the Kyoto Time Out and so on like that, Kansai Time Out, I guess it was. And in there was a file of Doso Roshi with that, and I cannot find it. It seems to have been lost.
Mm.
So it's I like to embody Doso Roshi's sort of who cares, couldn't care less about things gone, couldn't care less, whatever. CCL, as the Trungpa Rinpoche used to call it,
Hmm.
the CCL, couldn't care less, whatever, like that. I like to embody that, except I sure wish I had that document. I do
Yes,
care of having missed that. That would have been a real treasure to and actually something that could go in your archives. It's
absolutely.
still not. It's still not 100% certain that it's not somewhere in this house, but I've looked through all the boxes that I can find so far, and it hasn't emerged yet. So
I
stay
joke
tuned.
with my students, and sometimes, and I say, yeah, I'm very, very detached. And one of my students, okay, well then sell me your flute. I'm not that detached.
Yeah,
So, um, so what was he like?
it's interesting. It's
Oh,
interesting because the CCL thing is couldn't care less is a real thing which demonstrates your realization of Buddhism.
mhm,
One of the great professors of Buddhist studies in the U.S. just died a couple of days ago, Robert Thurman.
mhm,
He was a professor at Columbia University, and his daughter was Uma Thurman, the beautiful actress.
mhm.
And Robert Thurman was, disciple of the Dalai Lama and a great scholar of Madhyamika philosophy and so on and so forth. The Chittamantra philosophy that was studied in Japan. Great scholar that, and so I just read this anecdote today. I think it was that a student would say, I think I'm now really understanding what it's like to be egoless." And he had this short sort of quip back. "Just imagine yourself being unjustly accused. How do you feel?" If you think you're egoless, okay, let's accuse you unjustly in the world publicly. So being egoless is it's a real it's not like you lose an ego when you're a Buddhist practitioner, when you're a Zen practitioner. It's not like you lose the ego. You realize that It has no more reality than pure thin air. And
Do you know the
so
famous story of Ryokan Taigu and the story of So What?
so tell me.
So Ryokan Taigu, he's my favorite Japanese historical character. Um, Real person who lived and walked among us, and he was at one of the small temples where he was the head abbot. And one day, a father of this daughter from right down the street comes out to him and says, "You slept with my daughter, and she's pregnant. You will take care of the kid, and you will raise him, and you will take, and we will have nothing to do with it." And he goes, "Is that so?" And it's kind of like in Japanese, "Naruhodo desu ne," like that kind of thing. And so he takes the child and raises them up, and 6 months later, the father comes, and the child, his daughter had said, "Well, it actually wasn't the monk, it wasn't Ryokan, it was actually the neighbor boy who got me pregnant. I'm so sorry for lying to you about it." So the father goes over to Ryokan and says, "Please accept our apologies. I can't believe we did this to you. We'll take the baby back," and all this sort of thing. And he goes, "Oh, is that so?" And just lets it go. And I think that's like the sort of thing, like being accused unjustly. Ryokan just like you couldn't phase him ever, and it's just how he was. And I think there's a little bit of that with Watazumi. I don't like. Have you
What
ever
what
seen
what
him?
what what the
Mhm.
basis of that is understanding emptiness, and
Yes.
not only understanding it, but really realizing it. Because if everything is empty, then that means that everything has the same nature.
Hmm.
Praise and blame both have the same nature because they're both empty.
Hmm.
And if you actually go into more of a tantric, then they talk about the kadak and lundrup. Kadak means primordial purity, and lundrup means spontaneous presence. And when you realize that everything is the nature of primordial purity, that means that they talk about one taste. That's where the Zen people say everything is one. You know, one taste. That means that the one taste of praise and also blame. So that's what allowed Ryokan to actually say Naruhodo.
Hmm.
Naruhodo, okay, great. Naruhodo, great. Naruhodo, great. Because basically, if you're sitting and recognizing the view, in Buddhism, we talk about three: the view, the meditation, and the action. So without the view, the meditation and action just becomes an ego trip.
Hmm.
So you need to understand the view. The view of Kadak and Lundrup, say, for instance, would be the ultimate Buddhist view. And then the meditation is a practice that helps you realize the view and embody the view. And only once you've really embodied the view can you then actually go to the action, this kind of thing that Ryokan is demonstrating,
Yeah.
because he's demonstrating the view by that kind of articulation of those by saying Naruhodo desu ne. And so Watazumi-do Doso, that's what he was doing.
Hmm.
So when you say what was his philosophy, that's what he was trying to do. He was trying over and over and over to communicate to people what the view is.
Mm.
And it's not a view that depends on words, as the Zen transmission says.
Mm.
Not a view that depends on words.
Hmm.
And this is what he was trying to demonstrate to the world. And you can't demonstrate that through acceptable bureaucratic formulas.
What is your strongest memory of spending time with him?
Just the humor. Just always smiling, always laughing, and always a little bit caustic. But so you wanted to, you didn't want to, stick something out that he could, pounce on. So you learn how to be in his presence, but just the utter, fearless humor. I loved it. It was really something. And then
Hmm.
that sound. And you couldn't get him to do anything he didn't want to do. I had this funny thing. There was this one of the donors of the Zen Arts Center was this kind of really irritating character from New York, and he was kind of arrogant and irritating. and he didn't want to practice, but he wanted to donate a lot of money and then get his name on the masthead of stuff. And so he wanted to get a special one-on-one conversation with Doso Roshi.
Mm.
So Doso Roshi looks at me beforehand and he says, "Who is this guy?" So I said, "Well, I don't know, but it seems to be kind of a rich donor, and he doesn't seem to want to do much practice, but I don't know." The Doso Roshi said, "Well, what should I tell him?" And I said, "Well, maybe you could scold him a little, but be nice, see if you can inspire him." Oh, I don't know. So, this is that kind of, so the guy comes in and Dosa Roshi just let him have it. Just up one side and down the other, just, scathing. And the guy, you could tell he was expecting to be, "Oh, it's so good we have one of the major donors here." He's expecting that, but he got this scolding, and you could tell his face was getting redder and more pissed off, and more pissed off. And at the end, he came, just railing almost to attack me, and he said, "You put him up to doing that. It's your fault." Da 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 da, like that. So I think I sort of fucked around with one of the donors of the Zen Art Center. It's probably not a good idea to have done that, but that was it. But I remember he couldn't care less. Again, he couldn't care less what people thought of him.
CC, huh?
That's one of the things. He could care less what people thought of him.
Mm.
He's trying to demonstrate again the view. And if you're stuck within conventional reality of caring what people think of you, it's so pathetic. And he was railing against that, the way he carried himself. It was so good.
How do you think that that Watazumi would view the modern Shakuhachi world?
He'd probably roll his eyes. I don't know. I actually don't know the modern Shakuhachi world. Pretty much I spent the last 25 years, maybe now, studying Tibetan Buddhism, and so I don't know. I'm just sort of out of the Shakuhachi world, and I never was really in it, nor was I in the world of American Zen, which never seemed to make much sense to me. But yeah, so I mean, I just don't know. You'd have to answer that question. But if I knew if it was anywhere similar to how we viewed the Japanese Shakuhachi world, it was probably not that great.
Yeah, he said he had a few choice words to say about that. But for as far as legacy goes, before we go into closing reflections here, what do you think that future generations should take away from his life and teachings?
His sound, and really trying to embody the kind of power that he could bring to that. It's beyond music. We're not playing music here, and using the shakuhachi as a medium for realization based on the breath. And I think all of that would start with some Zen sitting. I think one would have to spend quite a lot of time doing some basic zazen, Zen sitting, to really gather your basic sanity and come back to yourself, touching your own nature, and then using the shakuhachi as a tool of developing realization. To me, if anyone could carry his legacy, it would be doing something like that.
After all of these years, looking back on that, what do you think the most important single lesson that you personally learned from Watazumi would be?
Don't let yourself grow old. Don't let yourself grow old. He was just railing against sitting on the couch. Get up, move, exercise. Move your fingers in all directions, move your toes in all directions, get all your muscles moving in your body. Don't grow old. To me, because he had such physical challenges as one leg shorter than the other, the chimbata business, and so he would rail against that for himself, So he wouldn't succumb to that weakness. That sense of not succumbing to your weaknesses is you know, I remember the pride that we had as Zen monks. The Zen monks. Our pride is this: no matter what happens, I'll still be standing at the end. That's the pride of an unsui, the Zen monk. No matter how hard it gets, I'll be the one standing in the end. He definitely had that, and he had that for throughout his whole life, and I so admire that because someone like me at 77 years old, there's people dropping at 77, and so I'm in this conversation, you're kind of reminding me of what it is that I should try to re-embody again.
So you're going to have to find out for what I think is one of the greatest one-sentence summarizations of Watazumi. And I'll tell you it after the camera's cut off. But
Oh, okay.
right, I won't leave you hanging that long. But I won't say it
Right,
here
very
because
good.
people have to watch all the way to the end of the video. So make sure you watch the end of the video and like and subscribe, do all that kind of stuff.
Fantastic.
But can you sum up Watazumi in one sentence?
Shugyo. There's no limit to how far you can go.
Chris, it's been an absolute pleasure today. Thank you so much.
Me too. Me too.
Part 6: Death and Legacy, the 20th Century Shakuhachi Genius. Watazumi Doso passed away on December of 1992, leaving behind no formal institution capable of containing him. There was no single school that could fully preserve his ideas, no doctrine that could neatly summarize his philosophy, and no consensus among his students regarding exactly what should be carried forward. In a strange way, this may have been inevitable. Watazumi spent much of his life resisting systems, classifications, and fixed identities. It would have been entirely out of character for him to leave behind something simple. Yet more than 3 decades after his death, his influence remains impossible to ignore. His sound continues to echo through the modern shakuhachi world. Players who have never studied his repertoire still wrestle with the question he forced into the open: what is the relationship between breath and music? Is the shakuhachi primarily an instrument, or is it something more? Can sounds function as spiritual practice? How much of the tradition should be preserved, and how much should be transformed through direct experience? Whether one agrees with his answers or not, nearly everyone who encounters Watazumi eventually finds themselves confronting these questions. His legacy extends beyond the shakuhachi as well. Long before mindfulness, breathwork, and embodied practice became popular subjects in the modern world, Watazumi was insisting that human beings had become disconnected from their own breathing. Long before musicians began questioning the boundaries between performance, ritual, and daily life, he was declaring that music itself was secondary. Long before artists spoke about authenticity, he was dragging rooted bamboos into concert halls and refusing to compromise for the sake of an audience's expectation. Of course, not everything he taught has aged equally well. Some of his claims were exaggerated. Some of his ideas were contradictory. His personality could be difficult, confrontational, and at times impossible. Even his own students disagree with him. Yokoyama Katsuya, perhaps his most famous disciple, spent much of his life respectfully challenging aspects of his teacher's vision. But perhaps that is exactly why Watazumi remains relevant. The truly important figures in history are rarely comfortable. They are not remembered because everyone agrees with them. They are remembered because they force us to reconsider our assumptions. Watazumi did that. He challenged musicians to reconsider music. He challenged Zen practitioners to reconsider Zen. He challenged shakuhachi players to reconsider the shakuhachi. And perhaps most importantly, he challenged people to reconsider themselves. After spending years of researching his life, reading interviews, translating articles, studying recordings, and listening to the memories of those who knew him personally, I am left with a surprising conclusion. I understand Watazumi less than when I began. Not because the facts are unavailable, not because the history is unclear, but because every answer seems to reveal another contradiction. Was he a Zen master or a spiritual rebel? A traditionalist or a revolutionary, a philosopher or a performer, a genius or a madman? The answer, I suspect, is yes. He was all of these things, and perhaps none of them. The deeper one looks, the more Watazumi begins to resemble the mountain mist that appears throughout so many of his stories. You can see its shape, you can feel its presence, but the moment you try to grasp it completely, it slips through your fingers. Maybe that is why his music continues to fascinate people. Not because it provides answers, because it points to something beyond them. And so, more than 30 years after his death, the old man from Kyushu still stands before us, a piece of bamboo in his hands, breathing into the unknown. The sound fades, the breath remains. As I was finishing the script for this video, I reached out to one final scholar for his input, Makihara Ichido, who has been studying shakuhachi for more than 60 years now. I asked him, "What can you tell me about Watazumi?" The following is a translation from our conversation. There are plenty of stories about him, but how much should I tell? He was a once-in-a-generation genius, an eccentric genius, a demonic genius who brought a revolution to the shakuhachi. Yet at the same time, some regarded him as one of the greatest frauds of his age. There is even a book he published that is held in the Aichi Prefectural Library. In it, he styled himself as the chief abbot of the Fuke sect. Supposedly, when he arrived in Nagoya or Osaka, the chiefs of the Aichi Prefectural Police and Osaka Prefectural Police would come out to greet him. It's astonishing. About 50 years ago, Watazumi Doso released a record. It was broadcast several times on NHK's FM's Contemporary Hogaku program, later renamed Contemporary Japanese Music, and sent shockwaves through the shakuhachi world. Yet apart from Yokoyama Katsuya, he accepted no disciples. He refused to meet anyone. His identity was completely unknown, and he became a mysterious, almost legendary figure. In response, our student Sankyoku Federation organized a concert featuring 5 solo performers: Aoki Shizuo, later known as Reibo, Yamamoto Hozan, Yokoyama Katsuya, the 5th generation Araki Kodo, and Watazumi-do Doso. Everyone expected that at last they would see the mysterious Watazumi in person. The tickets sold out completely, but he never appeared. He canceled at the last moment, and thus he became even more of a legend. On his record jackets, he wrote things like, "This is not a shakuhachi, but a dharma bamboo," and expounded what appeared to be profound philosophies of the Fuke sect with great seriousness and authority. Many shakuhachi players were completely taken in by it. Some still believe it to this day, but all of it was written to his own creation. The music he played was also entirely his own world, completely different from traditional honkyoku. I regard it as avant-garde art in classical style. Its originality was truly the work of a genius. There are just so many stories. At first, he called himself Watazumi of Hakata Ichoken. However, Miss Iso of Hakata Ichoken, the Fuke temple of Kyushu, publicly stated, "I don't know any Watazumi. He has nothing to do with us." Recently, I heard another version of the story. Apparently, Watazumi and Miss Iso had some kind of falling out, and that was why she went out of her way to deny and avoid any association with him. For many years, I searched for traces of where he had lived. Later, I discovered that until 1955, he actually lived in Yutenji, Meguro Ward, very close to my own home. A photographer of Nakameguro, whom I frequented, Mr. Arai, once said to me, "My father studied shakuhachi too, under a man named Tanaka something." I was absolutely stunned. This was back in the 1950s when the television was still black and white. There was a rock concert held on the banks of Shinano River in Niigata Prefecture. By chance, I happened to be watching it on TV. Suddenly, a strange, shaven-headed man appeared. "This bamboo was cut only moments ago," he declared. Then he pulled out an enormous shakuhachi and began to play. The sound exploded forth. 30,000 people who had been cheering and celebrating moments before were frozen into silence in an instant. I've never forgotten it. A single shakuhachi, his whole chiku, silenced 30,000 people. That overwhelming force, that spirit no one else could compare. He was a genius. He taught that the Fuke sect was also a way of staff technique and martial training. He swung bamboo tubes around to strengthen his body. Yet it was strangely ironic that he died so suddenly in a motorcycle accident. According to Yokoyama Katsuya, when he first sought Watazumi out to study shakuhachi, Watazumi refused to meet him. Yokoyama returned every day for a week. He stood outside the gate from morning until evening, bowing continuously. Only on the 8th day was he finally granted an audience. Watazumi told him, "If you are going to enter this path, show me that you have the resolve to never quit." For that reason, I had always heard that Yokoyama Katsuya was his only disciple. Yet recently, photographs have surfaced showing classrooms bearing signs of the Fuke sect, along with pictures of Watazumi surrounded by young students. There are also videos filmed in America that have appeared online. Another story concerns a magazine interview. A famous kabuki actor and celebrated actress were scheduled to hold a discussion at an elite traditional restaurant. Watazumi arrived nearby, covered himself in garbage from a trash can, disguised himself as a beggar, and attempted to enter the restaurant. The owner threw him out. At that point, he calmly revealed, "I am today's guest." Then he entered with complete dignity. He was the sort of eccentric monster who delighted in pulling tricks worthy of EQ. Everything I know about him is contained in these stories. As for the so-called philosophy of Fuke sect written on his record jackets, it's complete gibberish to me. I cannot see it as anything other than fabrication, and yet Watazumi's music changed the image of the shakuhachi. He expanded the boundaries of shakuhachi world. His art was magnificent. He was perhaps the single greatest figure responsible for spreading the shakuhachi throughout the world. In terms of madness, wildness, and untamed spirit, he was indeed worthy of being called the return of Fuke, or Fuke reborn in the present age. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the life of Watazumi Doso, be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your own experiences with Watazumi's recordings. What was your first reaction, fascination, confusion, inspiration, or all three at once? A special thanks to everyone who helped preserve interviews, recordings, photographs, and historical materials that made this research possible. And a particular thank you to those who personally knew Watazumi and share their memories. If you'd like to support future documentaries on the shakuhachi history, Honkyoku, Zen practice, and the remarkable people who shaped this tradition, consider joining this channel or supporting the project through the links below. Until next time, keep practicing, keep breathing, and remember, the bamboo is only a tool. What matters is the life that passes through it. Let's end the video with the words of Watazumi.
大空はまだ明けない。星が一つだけ光る。静かな眠りの世界を見る。鳥たちよ、目覚めて強く果てなく飛べ。大いに叫べ。人間どもに捕まるな。地上で私も負けてはいない。鳥たちよりは早く起き、一年気を上げ跳躍する。おー